Welcome to Echo and Ash, and thank you for tuning in to another original audio experience. Today, we are beginning a brand new storyline titled Ghosts in the Snow. This is episode 1. Please sit back, relax, and let the story unfold.
Ghosts in the Snow, Episode 1, Act 1, February 14th, 2028. The silence was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It had mass and pressure, a physical weight that pressed in on the eardrums and settled deep in the bones. It was the sound of 10 million square kilometers of permafrost holding its breath under a meter-thick blanket of white. Dr. Ben Carter, a man who had measured the deafening decibels of the Amazon rainforest at dawn and recorded the deep infrasonic groans of calving glaciers in Greenland, had never experienced anything quite like this. It was the profound, soul-crushing quiet of the Siberian taiga in late winter. It was a silence that felt older than mankind and profoundly indifferent to its existence. Outside the operations tent of his base camp, Ben stood on a windswept ridge and looked down into the crisp, white valley. The camp behind him consisted of 3 military-style thermal insulated tents, one for operations and communications, one for sleeping, and a mess tent. His team had assembled them after their chartered helicopter dropped them off a week ago, leaving them utterly alone. Now, an ocean of snow, punctuated by the dark, jagged slashes of larch and birch forests, rolled away to a horizon that blurred into a sky the color of bleached bone. Nothing moved, nothing at all. "Anything on the drone, Chloe?" Ben shouted back toward the operations tent. His voice felt too loud, like a small, vulgar intrusion against the ancient stillness. A puff of heavy white steam accompanied his words, lingering like a fleeting ghost of warmth in the -30-degree air. There was a moment of heavy silence. Then, Chloe Jenkins's voice, impossibly cheerful, drifted out through the canvas flaps. "Just more of the beautiful, beautiful nothing, Ben. I have got the drone at 400 feet, executing a 5-kilometer sweep, and all I am seeing is a masterclass in landscape photography. Lots of snow, lots of trees, not a lot of lynx, wolves, or bears. It is like the party is over and nobody bothered to tell us." Ben permitted himself a small, tight smile. The cold was brutal, but Chloe's relentless optimism was a resource as vital to the team as their satellite phones or their medical kits. At 26 years old, this was her first major expedition. It was her golden ticket out of a promising but unfulfilling career in high-end wedding photography and into the hallowed, frost-rimed halls of National Geographic. Her bright energy was a small, welcome furnace in the vast, empty cold. "All right," Ben called back, pulling his insulated collar up over his chin. "Keep the sweep going. Let me know if you see so much as a rabbit twitch." Beside him, a figure shifted. The sound of high-tech, weather-resistant fabric rustled like dry leaves. Marco Diaz, known to everyone simply as Mac, grunted. His eye was pressed tightly to the viewfinder of his primary camera, a bulky, heavily weatherproofed piece of equipment that looked more like a military weapon than an artistic tool. "The kid is not wrong, Ben," Mac rumbled. His voice was a low, gravelly counterpoint to the keening wind that whipped across the ridge. He lowered the camera and let it hang from its heavy strap. His face, framed by the thick fur-lined hood of his parka, was a textured roadmap of deep laugh lines and pale old frostbite scars. "This place feels empty," Mac continued, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. "The story right now isn't what we are finding. It is what we are not finding. It's a ghost story, Ben. We are hunting for ghosts." Hunting for ghosts. It had been Mac's morbidly accurate nickname for the expedition since its inception back in Washington. Their mission, funded by a hefty National Geographic grant, was ostensibly to document the dramatic effects of climate change on the Siberian ecosystem. Specifically, they were here to solve a biological puzzle that had been troubling global ecologists for the last 5 years. As the permafrost thawed, the landscape was radically changing. The shifting ground was releasing ancient carbon and fundamentally altering vegetation patterns. In theory, the herbivore population, the reindeer, the moose, and the grouse should be thriving on the unexpected new growth. And where the prey animals thrived, the predators should inevitably follow. But they weren't. Satellite data and preliminary studies showed a baffling, catastrophic decline in the populations of Eurasian lynx, gray wolves, and even the formidable Ussuri brown bears. The food chain was broken somewhere. The apex predators were simply vanishing. Their job was to find out where and why, and to capture the wildlife photography that would bring the crisis to the world. For the past week, they had been scouring this white abyss dropped deep into the Magadan Republic, a rugged Russian territory larger than Argentina, but with a population smaller than the state of Rhode Island. Specifically, they were camped near Lake Jack, London, an incredibly isolated fjord-like body of water surrounded by the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Anichag Range. They were a self-contained, high-tech tribe of 5. Ben, the expedition leader and environmental scientist; Mac, the veteran photographer, tasked with capturing the visual story; Chloe, the documentarian and drone pilot; Dmitry Volkov, their silent, stoic Russian guide and protector; and Dr. Kira Petrova, a brilliant biologist from the University of Yakutsk, who served as their scientific cornerstone. They were here to plant a network of sophisticated satellite trackers and motion-activated cameras. These devices would act as technological eyes in the wilderness, feeding them data long after the team had returned to civilization. But to set the traps, they first had to find signs of the animals they wanted to track. So far, they had found absolutely nothing. No fresh prints, no scat, no kill sites, just an endless ocean of frozen trees. "Life, finds a way, Mac," Kira's voice cut in sharply over Ben's two-way radio. Her tone was clipped and precise, carrying the crisp, rolling consonants of her native Russian. "It is just not always convenient for the photographers. Perhaps the animals are simply smarter than your cameras." Kira was currently down in the valley below, running soil and vegetation samples. Ben reached for the radio on his chest harness, holding down the transmission button. "What is your status, Kira?" he asked. He raised his heavy binoculars, adjusting the focus wheel with thick, gloved fingers. After scanning the white expanse for a moment, he found her. Kira was kneeling in the deep snow about a half-mile away, seemingly oblivious to the biting wind. Her attention was intensely focused on something on the ground. Even from this distance, Ben knew exactly what she was doing. She was a scientist to her very core, a woman who read the story of the world in DNA sequences and cellular biology, rather than in f-stops and focal lengths. The tension between her and Mac, the rigid scientist and the emotional storyteller, was a low-level, professional friction that Ben had to manage daily. The radio crackled back to life. "Grouse droppings," Kira reported. "A large concentration of them, but the composition is highly unusual." Ben motioned for Mac to follow him. He trudged through the deep, powdery snow, pushing his way back through the heavy flaps of the operations tent. Chloe looked up from her glowing monitor arrays as Ben and Mac stepped inside, bringing a rush of freezing air with them. "Put her on speaker," Mac said, brushing snow from his shoulders. Ben adjusted the radio frequency so Kira's voice broadcasted over the tent's main receiver. He trusted Kira's instincts implicitly. She was the one who saw the microscopic details that formed the foundation of the bigger picture. "Go ahead, Kira. We are all listening," Ben said. "The droppings are full of undigested berries," Kira's voice echoed in the small tent. "Specifically bog blueberries. Ben, They should not be fruiting this time of year. The ground should be entirely frozen. The permafrost thaw must be creating deep, subterranean warm pockets, confusing the root systems of the plants. So the grouse are eating well, Ben mused, leaning over the topographical map spread across the folding table. Which means their predators should be eating well. Exactly, Kira replied, the frustration evident even through the radio static. More food for the prey should mathematically mean more prey. More prey should mean a population boom for the predators. But here, the equation is broken. The system is sick. There was a long pause, filled only by the hiss of radio interference. This place does not feel right, Ben. It was the exact same sentiment Mac had expressed just moments ago, but coming from Kira, it carried a profoundly different weight. Mac felt stories. Kira felt data. When both instinct and mathematics pointed to the exact same conclusion, Ben paid close attention. Understood. We are coming to meet you. Let's rendezvous at the next survey point, Ben announced over the radio. He tried to inject a confidence into his voice that he didn't fully feel. Copy that, Kira replied. Ben turned his head toward the tent entrance. Dimitri, we are headed to survey point 3. Outside, standing ever vigilant by the supply sleds, their Russian guide simply offered a curt nod. Ben looked at Chloe and Mac. Grab your field packs. We are stepping off in 5 minutes. When they began their descent from the ridge, Dimitri took the lead. The man moved with a fluid economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime spent surviving in this brutal environment. He didn't fight the landscape, he flowed through it. His traditional felt-lined boots made barely a whisper on the wind-scoured snow. Dimitri was a man of very few words. His knowledge was derived not from textbooks or university lectures, but from the subtle language of the land itself, the metallic scent of the air, the crystalline texture of the snow, the heavy quality of the silence. Ben fell into step beside Chloe, watching her struggle slightly under the weight of her pack and camera harness. "How are you holding up?" Ben asked, raising his voice slightly over the wind. "I'm good," she chirped, her breath misting wildly around her face. It is amazing, Ben. It's definitely frustrating that we are not seeing any wildlife, but just to be out here, it is like walking on the surface of another planet." She patted the heavy camera against her chest. "I am getting some incredible B-roll footage anyway. The light out here is insane. Mac says the extreme cold air makes the photons line up all polite and orderly." Ben chuckled, his breath freezing on his scarf. "That is certainly one way of putting it. He is a good teacher." "The absolute best," Chloe agreed, adjusting her goggles. "Tough, but the best. Yesterday, he made me spend an entire hour shooting a single icicle hanging off the mess tent. An hour. He kept saying, 'Do not show me an icicle, Chloe. Show me the story of the water that froze.'" She shook her head in mock exasperation. "He is a poet with a light meter." It was true. Mac saw the world in cinematic frames, in complex compositions of light and shadow that told a visceral story that words never could. He was a living legend at National Geographic. This was a man who had once spent 3 agonizing days wedged inside a Himalayan crevasse with a compound fracture in his leg, calmly taking award-winning pictures of the surreal blue ice formations while waiting for the rescue chopper. He was their emotional anchor, a walking repository of survival experience and grim gallows humor. The afternoon wore on. The sun became a pale, distant disk behind the clouds, offering blinding glare but absolutely no warmth. They moved through a silent, towering forest of larch trees. The heavy branches sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. The air was so terrifyingly still that the only sound for miles was the rhythmic, exhausting crunch of their own snowshoes. It was not a long trek geographically, but it was a grueling one in the waist-deep powder. They finally met Kira at Survey Point 3, a shallow basin protected from the prevailing wind by a massive granite outcrop that rose from the snow like the jagged spine of some long dead beast. It was shortly after they arrived, while Kira was cataloging a new batch of soil samples, that Dmitri suddenly stopped pacing. He held up a thickly gloved hand. Silence fell over the group instantly. Dmitri pointed to a depression near the base of a massive birch tree. "Volk," he said. The single Russian word for wolf hung heavily in the frigid air. Ben and Kira immediately dropped to their knees. The tracks were faint, their edges already softening and filling in with wind-blown snow, but they were entirely unmistakable. Large, distinct paw prints. It was a single wolf, and judging by the wide spacing between the strides, it had been moving incredibly fast. "This is it," Ben said, feeling a sudden jolt of adrenaline cutting through his fatigue. "It is the very first fresh predator sign we have seen in a week." He eagerly reached into his parka for his digital data logger, but Dmitri was not smiling. The guide was frowning deeply, his dark eyes tracing the frantic path of the prints into the thickest part of the woods. "Odinoki," Dmitri murmured, his voice tight. "Alone, and in a great hurry. A wolf should never be alone in the dead of winter, and a wolf should not be running at a full sprint from nothing." Kira carefully reached out, running her gloved fingers along the icy edge of the print. "He is right, Ben. A pack hunts together. A lone wolf in this season is either a desperate outcast or a sole survivor." She looked up at Ben, her brow deeply furrowed beneath her wool hat. "Something is fundamentally wrong with this picture." The heavy unease settled over the team once again. They were scientists and journalists trained to be objective. They were taught to gather empirical data and draw rational, peer-reviewed conclusions. But the Siberian taiga did not operate on human rationality. It operated on an older, much more brutal logic. The suffocating silence, the complete absence of standard life, the lone, fleeing wolf. They were all data points of a kind, painting a grim picture that none of them could yet understand. They spent the remainder of the fading afternoon taking scat samples, photographing the disturbed snow, and searching in vain for the rest of the pack. When the shadows began to stretch long and blue across the ice, Ben finally called it. They made the grueling trek back to their base camp. The evening routine of securing the camp for the night was a familiar, necessary comfort. Heavy winter sleeping bags were unpacked and fluffed. Wet socks and thermal base layers were hung on lines inside the tents to dry. The small, incredibly powerful camp cook stoves were fired up, roaring to life with a mechanical hiss that felt like a brave defiance of the encroaching twilight. Inside the mess tent, the air quickly grew warm, thick with the smell of melting snow, burning butane, and rehydrated beef stroganoff. Surrounded by thick canvas walls, it was a fragile bubble of warmth and light holding back the immense frozen darkness outside. "Well, to another successful day of not being eaten by a yeti," Mac toasted, raising a battered metal mug of steaming black tea. Chloe laughed, scraping a heap of rehydrated mashed potatoes onto her aluminum plate. "Honestly, Mac, I would settle for just seeing a yeti at this point. At least it would be something to put on film." "Do not joke," Dmitri said softly. The table went quiet. Dmitri sat at the far end of the tent, his face half hidden in the harsh shadows cast by the LED lantern. He followed his words with a long, slow swig from his own metal mug, which was filled to the brim with clear vodka. Dmitri rarely spoke during their evening meals, and his sudden interjection immediately commanded their full attention. He lowered his cup and looked at Chloe with absolute, deadpan seriousness. "There are things in these woods, little bird, that are much older than your stories. My grandmother used to say that when the ancient forest goes quiet, it is not empty." He leaned forward slightly. "It is listening." The light-hearted atmosphere evaporated instantly. Mac set his tea down and looked at the Russian guide, a flicker of genuine journalistic interest sparking in his eyes. "What exactly does that mean, Dmitri?" Mac asked quietly. Dmitri stared past them, looking at the canvas wall as if he could see through it, straight into the black woods beyond. "It means that something is out there that does not belong," Dmitri whispered. "Something that makes the great wolf run in terror. Something that makes the birds hide in the deep brush. Something that has made the entire forest hold its breath." Ben felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up his spine, and he knew it had absolutely nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures outside. He looked across the table at Kira. She was staring blankly down into her mug, her face pale, her scientific mind clearly struggling to categorize the dread pooling in her stomach. They were all feeling it now, the psychological weight of the silence, the creeping, primal sense of being watched by an unseen, unknown presence in the dark. Their mission had been to find out where the predators had gone. But as the Arctic night fully descended, swallowing their tiny camp in total blackness, a new, far more terrifying question began to form in Ben's mind. The question wasn't, "Where have the predators gone?" The question was, what did they run away from?
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for the continuation of this series as the unseen threat begins to spread through the Siberian wilderness. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for watching.